In 1995, the average American family could buy a house on a single income, afford college tuition with a summer job, and retire with a pension at 62. By the time Millennials showed up to claim any of that, every single one of those things had vanished. The house costs 4 times what it did. The degree costs 10 times what it did. And the pension? That disappeared before they ever clocked in for their first day of work. But here is what makes this story different from the usual "millennials have it tough" conversation. This was not bad luck. This was a sequence of specific policy decisions, financial deregulations, and institutional failures that unfolded over 30 years. And every single one of them landed on the same generation. To understand how that happened, you have to go back to the world they were promised. If you grew up in the 80s or the 90s, you absorbed a very specific version of the American dream. Your parents told you about it. Your teachers reinforced it. Guidance counselors practically tattooed it on your forehead. Go to college, get a degree, companies will line up to hire you, you will earn more than your parents, you will buy a house, you will retire comfortably. For the generation that came before, this had actually worked. The post-war economy created the largest middle class in human history. A factory worker in Detroit in 1965 could support a family of 4, own a home, and retire with a full pension at 60. That was real. But the cracks started forming long before millennials were born. In 1973, worker productivity and wages decoupled. Before that year, the two had risen together almost perfectly. After 1973, productivity kept climbing, while real wages for working Americans flatlined. The Economic Policy Institute calculated that between 1979 and 2020, productivity grew by roughly 60%, while worker compensation grew by less than 16%. All that extra value went to shareholders and executives at the top. So by the time millennials entered the workforce, wages had already been hollowed out for decades. The jobs paid less in real terms than the same jobs had paid their parents. And yet, the cost of everything kept climbing, especially college. Between 1980 and 2020, the average cost of attending a 4-year public university went from roughly $3,000 a year to over $22,000 a year. That is more than a 700% increase. The reason was straightforward. State legislatures slashed funding for public universities throughout the 1990s and the 2000s. In 1990, state funding covered about 73% of the cost of educating a student. By 2020, that had dropped to roughly 45%. The difference got shifted directly onto students through tuition hikes. At the same time, the federal student loan system expanded massively. Total student loan debt went from $250 billion in 2003 to over $1 trillion by 2013. Today it sits at roughly $1.75 trillion. The government made it easier to borrow at the exact same time states were making college more expensive. Students took out enormous loans because they had been told a degree was the only path to a good career. Schools raised prices because the loan money kept flowing. The result was an entire generation entering adulthood carrying an average of $30,000 in debt, looking for jobs in an economy that was about to collapse. Because right as the first wave of millennials started graduating, Wall Street was busy building the bomb that would detonate the entire economy. Throughout the 90s, the banking industry had been systematically deregulated. The Glass-Steagall Act, which had separated commercial banking from investment banking since 1933, was repealed in 1999. Banks started handing out mortgages to anyone with a pulse, stopped verifying income, stopped requiring down payments, and loaded adjustable rates designed to skyrocket. These toxic mortgages were packaged into securities, slapped with AAA credit ratings, and sold to investors around the world. When the housing market collapsed in 2007 and 2008, it triggered the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. The stock market lost roughly 50% of its value. Unemployment hit 10%. 8.7 million jobs vanished. The oldest millennials were 27 when the crash hit. The youngest were still in middle school. Graduates walked across stages in 2008 and 2009 with diplomas in hand and resumes ready to go into a job market where entry-level positions had simply disappeared. Researchers at the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis found that Americans who entered the job market during the recession earned 9% less than those who started during normal conditions, even a full decade later. The damage compounded. If you started earning less, you saved less. If you saved less, you invested less. And by the time the economy recovered, asset prices had already climbed out of reach. If you're finding this useful, hit subscribe. I cover the hidden forces shaping your financial reality every week. Now, about that housing market, the crash should have been a reset. Home prices dropped sharply between 2008 and 2012. But instead of millennials buying affordable homes, institutional investors swept in first. Firms like Blackstone spent billions purchasing foreclosed properties with cash, converting single-family homes into rental properties. By some estimates, institutional investors bought more than 1 in 4 homes sold in certain Sunbelt markets during the recovery. Meanwhile, the cities where millennials wanted to live had spent decades making it nearly impossible to build new housing. Zoning laws restricted construction. Existing homeowners fought every development. In Los Angeles, San Francisco, New York, Denver, and Austin, supply simply could not keep up with demand. In 1980, the median home price was roughly 3 times the median household income. By 2023, that ratio had stretched past 5.5 times. In cities like San Francisco and San Diego, homes cost more than 10 times the median income. For the generation that was supposed to build wealth through home ownership, the front door was locked. But housing was only one piece. The nature of the work itself was transforming underneath their feet. American companies used to operate under a basic social contract. You showed up, worked hard, and they provided a salary, health insurance, a retirement plan, and job security. That contract eroded through the 80s and accelerated in the 2000s. Companies replaced full-time employees with contractors, temps, and gig workers who got none of the protections previous generations took for granted. By the time millennials entered the workforce, this shift was nearly complete. Companies like Uber, Lyft, and DoorDash built empires on the idea that their workers were not actually employees. Instead of calling it, "We eliminated your benefits," it was rebranded as flexibility and being your own boss. A generation that could not find stable employment was told that instability was actually freedom. Meanwhile, healthcare costs grew roughly 3 times faster than wages. The average annual premium for family health insurance hit over $22,000 in 2022. A Kaiser Family Foundation survey found that roughly 1 in 4 millennials skipped or delayed medical care because they could not afford it. Medical debt became the leading cause of personal bankruptcy in the country. And retirement? In 1980, roughly 60% of private sector workers had a defined benefit pension. By 2020, that number had fallen to 15%. What replaced pensions was the 401k, originally designed as a supplement, not a replacement. A 2019 study found that the median millennial retirement account balance was approximately $23,000. Financial advisors generally suggest 1 to 2 times your annual salary saved by 35. The projection is clear. A large percentage of millennials will work well into their 70s because they will have no other option. With all of this documented, you would think the cultural conversation would center on these systemic failures. Instead, the dominant narrative for nearly a decade was that millennials were lazy, entitled, and bad with money. In 2017, an Australian newspaper column blamed millennial struggles on avocado toast. Time magazine put them on its cover as the me generation. Cable news panels of older commentators diagnosed millennial laziness as if the answer was a character flaw rather than an economic impossibility. But think about who owned those outlets and sat on those panels. People who bought homes decades earlier, graduated without significant debt, and entered a job market that still offered pensions. The framing served a purpose. If young people are irresponsible, nothing systemic needs to change. The data tells a completely different story. A 2019 Federal Reserve analysis found that millennials held just 4.6% of total household wealth. When baby boomers were the same age, they held 21%. That is not a gap, that is a canyon. And the cruelest part is the compounding. Wealth builds on wealth. When you start behind on home ownership, savings, and retirement contributions, the gap does not stay the same. It widens every year. A Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis study found that families headed by someone born in the 1980s had wealth levels 34% below expectations based on earlier generations. This is not about avocado toast. This is about a generation that followed the rules of a game that had already been rigged before they sat down to play. Millennials did not break the system. The system broke first, and then it blamed them for the wreckage. If this video reframed how you think about generational economics, the video on screen right now goes even deeper into one of the forces we covered today. Click it and subscribe.